Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I made this realistic Waffle House diorama with a full interior and working lights. This project took lots of time to make, but I'm super happy with the way it turned out. Let's get started with the build. First, I designed the building in CAD and then I printed out the elevations of each wall. I used the drawings as a template to make all of the window frames from styrene plastic strips. I just simply line up the strips with the drawing, score it with a blade where I want to cut the plastic, and then snap it in half. Then, the strips of plastic are placed along the drawing and glued together with some Tamiya extra thin cement. When working with styrene, it's ideal to use a glue like extra thin cement because it softens the plastic and welds the two pieces into one. It's a bit tedious to make all of these windows, but the template makes the process go by pretty quickly. For the walls, I use 1/8 inch thick PVC foam board, which is easy enough to cut by hand. Starting with the front, long wall, I use super glue to glue the wall in place below the window frame. Rather than scribing individual bricks, I decided to try out this embossed plastic sheet. Once cut to the right size, the brick texture was glued to the PVC board using super glue. I go over the seams with some extra thin cement, and then I use Tamiya putty to fill any gaps at the seams. Once dry, the putty is sanded back using a sanding stick. Next, another sheet of PVC board is cut for the upper half of the wall and once again is glued in place with super glue. This process is repeated for the rest of the walls with windows. Once all of the walls are assembled, I glue them together at the corners using more super glue. For stability when handling this piece, I glued in this floor plate to keep everything stable. The square posts are cut and added to the corners. They're secured to the other plastic pieces using extra thin cement. More brick texture is glued in place under the windows of the remaining two walls. Then, the seams again are filled with putty. While I had it handy, I also used the putty to fill in a few dents in the PVC board. This is how the model looks so far. Now it's time to work on the second half of the building. I cut out the back walls, again using PVC board, and then I covered them with plastic brick sheets. I cut out a few holes in the brick for where I'll eventually put some doors later on. There's still lots of work that needs to be done to this section, but for now, we'll work more on the side of the building with windows. Waffle Houses typically have large angled yellow signs above the windows, so I'm marking where my framework is going to be for the sign. I designed and 3D printed the profile for the angle so that each piece is consistent. I just glue them in place with super glue. The line above the windows gets tidied up with some 90-degree angle styrene. Then, I use 020 thick sheets of styrene to make the sign above the windows. I just apply glue onto the 3D printed supports and then I add the styrene sheets on top. Don't worry about the seams where the styrene sheets meet, we'll cover these up later. Honestly, I was pretty nervous about this step, but it actually ended up being super easy and it went a lot smoother than I thought. Then, I added some more styrene strips under the sign based off some reference images. Here's how the model looks so far, and it looks a bit bare at the moment and could really use some paint. The yellow sign is going to be the first thing that I paint, so I start to mask off everything else with masking tape and saran wrap. The masking tape gets the sharp edge and the saran wrap helps save tape. Any places where multiple pieces of wrap meet are sealed with more tape. This is how it looks all masked up and ready for paint. First, I prime the surface using white surface primer. Looking back on it though, I should have started with gray. You'll see why pretty soon. I used Tamiya yellow in the spray can, and after several coats, I felt that the color was off. To me, it was a bit too orangey and it made it look like a toy in my opinion. I did a test piece using the same paint but starting with a gray base primer instead of white. The color looked better to me, so I went over the yellow with the gray and then over the gray with the yellow again. It looked better, but I still wasn't happy. All of the Waffle Houses that I've been to have a really pale, faded yellow look, so I mixed up my own custom yellow and I sprayed it through my airbrush. And finally, I was happy with the way that it turned out. After all of that, I sealed the yellow with a few coats of flat clear coat by Tamiya. Once everything was thoroughly dry, I unmasked everything, just to remask the building to paint the bricks next. I used a brick red looking primer from Rust-Oleum and sprayed it right out of the can. After the primer dried, I filled the mortar joints using spackle. I just apply the spackle with my fingers and then wipe away the rest with a paper towel. Lastly, I mask the surface one more time to paint the window frames. I start with a few coats of gray surface primer out of the can. For the silver, I first started with Tamiya flat aluminum, but it was way too sparkly to look like real aluminum. So then I sprayed over that with all-clad chrome, which has a much finer metallic flake. The chrome paint over the dull gray base looks just like aluminum. To make chrome, all-clad requires a gloss black base, which I'll show you later on in this video. After painting everything so far, I 3D printed some letters for the Waffle House sign and I sprayed them black with the Duplicolor primer. I printed out a paper template with the letters properly spaced and I cut holes in the template where each letter goes. Then, I taped the template onto the sign and I individually glued the letters in place with super glue. I did this for both walls along the front half of the building. It was definitely a bit nerve-wracking since any mistake would ruin the yellow paint below, but thankfully the paper template helped a lot and everything went well. I noticed lots of Waffle Houses have these aluminum strips along the signs, so I just painted a few strips of styrene and glued them in place based off of some photos. These strips are what I used to hide the seams where the yellow pieces of styrene met. With all of that glued in place, this is how the model looks so far. I'm pretty pleased with it and it's shaping up very nicely. Moving on to the base, I used a large sheet of 1/4 inch thick PVC foam board for the sidewalk. I draw out the sidewalk lines with a pencil and a T-square before scribing those lines in with a knife and a metal ruler. When scribing, make sure you wrap the lines around the curb. I wanted the sidewalk to have a broomed concrete finish, and the PVC board is pretty robust. Using a straight edge and some 120 grit sandpaper, I sanded back and forth in the direction that I wanted the lines to go. I want the sidewalk to be a light bleached concrete, so I painted it first with a very light gray acrylic wash. I weathered the surface with some more diluted black and brown washes until I was happy with the finish. For additional detail and texture, more black wash was speckled over the sidewalk. Then, the entire sidewalk piece is glued to my larger MDF and wood base, which will soon be painted to look like a parking lot. I continue the sidewalk by gluing in a ramp, a curb, and some styrene pieces for the accessible parking. I 3D modeled and printed some tactile paving for the walkway and another piece of styrene for the curb. I continued the curb with some more XPS foam painted gray for the parking lot's perimeter edge. Then, all the assembled pieces got lightly weathered with some more acrylic washes. I'm trying out a new technique for asphalt that I recently learned from Boomer Diorama. If you haven't already done so, you should go check out his channel because it's full of so many useful tips and techniques, and I've learned a lot from him. I'll link his channel in the description below. So basically, I just start spreading on this crackle paste for the base layer of my asphalt finish. Moving on, the next texture that is used is ceramic stucco, and this one is super cool. It has really fine particles of sand or something else mixed in, and it scales perfectly for asphalt. I'm not covering the entire surface, and I'm making sure to leave some of the crackle paste from underneath showing. Once all of the acrylic pastes are dry, here's how the texture looks. Next, a coat of water is added over top of the surface, which will help the paint flow into all of the cracks and crevices. You can really use any color you want for this step, but I ended up using a combination of dark sea gray and dark blue gray by Vallejo, which is what Boomer Diorama recommended. Keeping the paint thin is really good for combining the effects since it allows you to add depth with several layers of paint. After it dried, I slightly sanded the surface with some 120 grit sandpaper, which really helped make the surface look more worn and weathered. I used some masking tape to mask off the lines for accessible parking along with the typical parking spaces. Starting with the accessible parking, I added some blue into my airbrush and I started spraying the squares for the logos as well as the lines for the walkway. This part was one of my favorites for some reason. It kind of felt like I was painting a real road surface but just really small. From what I could tell, most Waffle Houses have yellow parking lines, so I started spraying those while I waited for the blue paint to completely dry. Once it did dry, I taped on a stencil that I cut out with an X-Acto blade, and then I sprayed the logo with the white paint. While I usually hate taping and masking, painting all of these lines and logos was super satisfying to do, and it made all of the prep work worth it. Here's how the base looks so far with the final concrete and asphalt finishes. backtracking a little bit here, earlier I applied a coat of Sculptamold where I plan on adding some dirt and grass out front of the building. No crazy scenery work here, I'm just trying to raise the surface by a 1/4 inch to match the sidewalk height. The Sculptamold was painted brown after it dried to cover up all the white, and then a thin layer of glue is applied along with some real dirt over top of the brown paint. I started by sprinkling on some dirt and then lightly pressed it down to make it appear smoother for a more in-scale finish. Then all of the dirt gets soaked with isopropyl alcohol and then watered down matte Mod Podge, which helps lock everything in place. The isopropyl alcohol allows the Mod Podge to soak through all of the dirt. Here's the dirt a day later once all the glue dried. I masked off a few areas with tape, and now I'm applying full strength matte Mod Podge in a patchy layer over the dirt using a brush. Once applied, I cover the glue with some static grass using my static grass applicator. Any loose static grass is vacuumed away and the tape is removed, revealing clean lines towards the edges of the lawn. The model was looking good so far, but I realized a big problem at this point. I originally designed this model to be an exterior only model by using tinted glass like I did with my Starbucks build last year. I thought it worked out really well for Starbucks and I didn't have to build the inside because of it. However, with how much glass Waffle House has, I figured that it would look too weird and unrealistic if you couldn't see inside, which meant that I had to take the time to design the whole interior. And this is a good point to thank Elegoo for sending me one of their new machines to try out. In the middle of making this video, Elegoo offered to send me their new Mars 5 Ultra, which was a 3D printer that I was considering buying for myself before they reached out. The Mars 5 Ultra has lots of new features like a self-leveling build plate and a tilting resin vat, both of which help prevent your prints from failing. I ended up using it for all of my 3D printed parts on this project, and I was really pleased with the prints. I mean, the quality and detail speaks for itself. My only issue with the printer is I feel like that sometimes the prints stick too well to the build plate, even after decreasing the bottom exposure layer by a lot. Some of my prints just felt glued to the plate, but otherwise I think it's a great machine and it helped me out a lot with this project. So after designing and printing all of these pieces for the interior, I took them outside to paint, starting with the bar stools and chairs. I separated the stools into 3 parts, 2 of which required a gloss black base coat, and the other part was painted red. The metal base of the stool was then painted with all-clad chrome over the gloss black finish, and I think it turned out great. The chairs were also painted with all-clad chrome, but over a gloss gray base coat to match the lighter shade of the real chairs. The 3 parts of the stools were assembled with super glue, and the booths were made by cutting out a gray laminate texture printed on paper, and then gluing that to the seat painted black. The corners of the paper are trimmed to match the rounded edges of the seat, and the gloss red cushion is glued in place. The frames for the booths were made just like the windows using styrene and extra thin cement. After making a few, they were painted gloss black, and then the 2 booth seats were glued on top of the frame with super glue. The tabletops are just a piece of plastic with a printed texture glued on top, and they got glued on top of the frame as well. The countertops are made in a similar fashion, first by cutting out pieces of styrene and PVC board to the right dimensions. Then, they get laminated with the printed paper and all of the pieces get glued together. Small 3D printed pieces like the ketchup and mustard bottles all get painted in their respective colors, while the napkin holders, waffle makers, large toasters, and condiment holders all get painted with all-clad chrome paint. Again, some of these miniatures are base coated in either gray or black depending on what surface finish the references show. After painting, a couple of trays are glued onto the waffle maker, and then the waffle presses themselves are glued on top of the trays. I don't know why, but these small waffle makers are one of my favorite details that I've modeled, 3D printed, and painted. In case anyone doesn't know, I 3D model all of my own files that I 3D print, and I offer them to my Gold and Platinum members on Patreon. If you want to download my STL files for this project or any of my previous projects, check out my Patreon linked in the description below. Miniature menus are printed out and covered in a glossy laminating sheet, and I glue them in place standing upright into the wire condiment rack as seen in real life. I also glue a few menus flat on the countertops for some variety. I 3D printed some small waffles for fun, and I'm painting on some syrup with a mix of Tamiya clear orange and smoke. Here's how all the different seating arrangements look, and I'm pretty pleased with the way they turned out. Going back to the exterior, lots of Waffle Houses have concrete parking stops in each parking space, so I modeled and printed some, and I textured them with some Mod Podge for a rougher finish. I sprayed them with first a darker primer, and then I painted them yellow to match the parking lines. I filled in the holes with a couple pieces of styrene rod, and then the styrene got painted with some enamel rust washes made by AK. Each parking stop was glued in place using super glue. The most difficult part of the build was definitely adding the glass. It looked super easy in the footage, but it required lots of precision glue placement. I ended up using some 0.015 inch thick polycarbonate sheets, and then I peeled off the protective backing after it was glued in. I added some small 3D printed details to the doors, like a door handle, a lock, a pull sign, and some hinges. I cut another piece of polycarbonate for the entryway so I can add some posters. I didn't want to glue the posters outside the building, and I also didn't want to apply glue to the front of the posters, so I sandwiched them between two pieces of glass. Anyone that's been to Waffle House knows that there's lots of printed graphics by the front door, and those were details that I didn't want to miss. The posters are glued to the second piece of glass using Mod Podge, and I use my X-Acto knife to position them where I want them. I designed this graphic for the floor, and I glued this piece to the front of the restaurant. More embossed styrene sheet was used for the tile, and I accentuated the grout lines with Tamiya's black panel line enamel wash. Enamel thinner with a Q-tip removed any extra stains of wash on the surface of the tile. Then, these tile walls were glued beneath the windows just like the brick was on the outside. I ended up not filming the process, but I built all of the window frames again for the interior, and I glued them directly to the glass. After gluing in the rest of the floor, I started to build the interior wall of the right side of the model. I cut out a couple doors for the bathroom and kitchen, and I added a section of brick and then glued it to the second half of the building that we made earlier. All of the brick scenes were again filled with Tamiya putty and sanded smooth with the sanding stick. Then I took this section outside and I sprayed it with that brick colored Rust-Oleum primer. Once again, the spackle was smeared into the mortar joints and then wiped away. One complaint I have with this embossed plastic is that the mortar joints are really shallow, so it's easy to accidentally wipe out the spackle completely. I think laser etched brick would look more realistic. However, this plastic is more readily available to everyone. I got mine off eBay. I 3D modeled and printed some doors based off of reference images, and I glued them in place. Some styrene trim was added, and then I painted the doors with a custom mixed orangey red color using my airbrush. Once dry, I superglued some really small 3D printed hinges, a latch, and some styrene. Then, signs and security cameras were added to the wall using more superglue. The interior wall got covered with more tile, and I glued some more doors and trim in place around them. Then, the classic black and yellow tile was added. I just printed it on paper and glued it with Mod Podge. More images of signature dishes were glued in place above the black and yellow tile. Then, I glued this piece to the base using superglue. Using the same methods previously shown, I made this little entryway that's typical of every Waffle House that I've been to. Some black trim made from styrene strips is glued in place, and then I started to make the back wall kitchen area. I didn't previously design the layout of the kitchen, so I just eyeballed everything on sheets of styrene based off of some pictures. Basically, I just fabricated a simple counter with cabinets and I made the hood for the stove, along with some shelves and other details. Once assembled, I painted it black and then chrome. I started with a stainless steel paint, but it was way too dark. After the paint dried, I glued on the hood with some other small details like a bunch of plates that I 3D printed. Some wood-textured styrene is glued along the countertop, along with some of the waffle makers and large toasters from earlier. The styrene tile sheets, black and yellow tile, as well as the food graphics are all glued in place just like the previous wall. Once it was all done, the kitchen was glued to the base and I started to add all of the furniture inside. I started with all of the countertops, then the chairs and bar stools, and then the booths. All of my references showed extra chairs in the front of the restaurant, so I glued some down in front of the windows. This is how the model looks with all of the furniture glued in place. At this point, I was really happy that I decided to make the interior. I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't have been satisfied with the result. But we're still not finished because now we have to make the ceiling and the lighting. I used a for rent sign for the ceiling because it was the only sheet of plastic large enough to do the trick that I had on hand. I sanded the surface and I scored some grid lines using a utility blade. I drilled several holes for the light fixtures and I cut out some rectangular pieces for the light panels. After a coat of glossy gray paint, this is how it looks. I covered the rectangular holes with this frosted clear plastic which will help diffuse the light behind it. I fed the wires through the holes and then I glued the light fixture in place with super glue. After wiring all of the lights, it looked like a mess, but I was able to set the ceiling in place and the lighting looked fantastic. It really helped set the mood. I glued the last exterior brick wall in place and then I started making the roof from another piece of PVC board. I marked out some lines with a T-square and a pencil and then scored them with a utility blade and a metal ruler. The roof got sprayed with a light gray primer and then it was weathered with a simple dark brown acrylic wash. It was brushed all over and then patted away with paper towels to leave behind an irregular weathered surface. The roof was then installed over top of everything and I lined it with more PVC strips to thicken the walls. These large styrene strips were sprayed the aluminum color and then glued over top of the walls and yellow sign which capped them off nicely. The yellow sign had some red framework over top for lighting, so I 3D modeled and printed the design. All of the pieces were assembled with super glue and the plain support pieces were made using styrene strips. After spraying them with some Tamiya red paint, styrene tubes were installed to look like lights. Unfortunately, I didn't have the right LED filaments to actually make them light up. Then, the red pieces were installed on top of the silver styrene pieces that we just added. I made some bases for the rooftop HVAC units and I glued 4 of them in place based off of photos. A few more details were glued in place after designing them, printing them, and painting them chrome. I assembled some components of the rooftop units and then I prepped the bodies for paint. After gluing the vent cover on top, I painted them with some Rust-Oleum filler primer, being sure not to fill in any fine details. Once again, this was weathered with some dark brown acrylic wash and then wiped away with paper towels. Here's how it looks after the wash, and I darkened the vent on top using more paint. Then, I started gluing on several logos and manufacturing stickers onto the unit with some Mod Podge. I feel like small details like these adds lots of realism to the model. After the stickers, all of the components are assembled to look like this. Then, the 4 rooftop units are glued on top of the bases that we installed earlier. I built this ladder made from resin sides, and then the steps are styrene rod. The edge of the roof gets sealed off with styrene strips painted in various finishes, and then the ladder is super glued to the wall after a coat of black paint. I had a series of pipes for the rooftop units. I'm no expert when it comes to this stuff, and reference images of Waffle House rooftops are pretty scarce, so I did the best that I could when laying the pipe. I noticed the pipes usually sat on these black rubber looking things, so I added those to the rooftop as well. I 3D printed some clamps, painted them bright silver, and glued them over top of the pipes. Black and yellow pilasters were added to the back of the building, and then accessible parking signs were added out front. I glued in a few more pipes to the roof, and I made this utility box to cover up the battery pack for the lights. 5 small bushes from Diorama Precipice were added out front of the building, and with that, the model is finished. Here's how the model looks complete, and I took it outside and got these shots of the final result. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I only wish that the lights looked a little brighter in the daylight, but they look great at night. This project was originally supposed to be a quick and easy build, but with the unexpected change to create the full interior, this simple project turned into my most complex and time-consuming one yet. I'd like to get out long-form content more quickly than I have been, so between large projects, I may sprinkle in some model car kit videos. I know it's not for everyone, but I'll be able to use the cars in future dioramas, so I'm not always using these same cars. Also, thank you so much for helping me reach 100,000 subscribers recently. I plan on making a video about that soon, just whenever I get the plaque in the mail. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much, and I'm super grateful for all of the support. I also want to give a big thank you and shout out to all of my awesome Patreon members. Thank you so much for directly supporting me in my work, and please know that your generous contributions directly fund these models, and it means the world to me. If you'd like to support me and join my Patreon, check out the link in the description. Depending on what tier you select, you'll have access to behind-the-scenes updates of whatever project that I'm working on, as well as exclusive Q&A videos, 3D print files, PDFs of graphics and architectural drawings for this project and all of my previous ones, and much more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.